Kyle. This is the second part of our civil rights lecture that's going to focus on the transition to Jim Crow all the way through modern day civil rights issues. So, we want to start off by sort of a reminder of where we were. So, we had dealt with slavery and the Civil War, and now we're kind of transitioning to a post Civil War era. And so we are now trying to figure out how we're going to exist together in a society that largely has been rooted in inequality for the last 200 years. So we start off with the South really trying to combat some of the racial progress that we had made over the last decade. Southern states passed laws like the Black Codes, which were a set of restrictive laws passed mostly in the southern parts of the United States immediately following the Civil War that attempted to control the lives and labor of newly freed African Americans. While it granted some limited rights like owning property, these codes enforced segregation, denied fundamental civil rights such as voting and jury service, and used laws like those for vagrancy or not having a place to live to force black people into labor contracts, and effectively it restored a system similar to slavery. In order to secure cheap and steady labor force for Southern landowners, it would bind black people to cover these contracts and prevent them from seeking other opportunities for employment. In order to maintain the racial hierarchy that existed prior to the war, it limited the social, political, and economic freedoms of African Americans. It used things like vagrancy laws that mandated that unemployed black people could be arrested, fined, or forced into labor to pay off their debts. It also created these labor contracts that required black people to have written proof of employment for the upcoming year and penalized those who left their jobs before their contracts ended. It also prohibited African Americans from voting, serving on juries, and testifying against whites. It also held that certain occupations didn't have high pay, and it would withhold certain occupations from African Americans. It also placed restrictions on the types of land that black people could own and where they could live. It allowed for the forced apprenticing of black miners, often to their former enslavers, giving masters control over their labor once again. The Black Codes caused outrage in the North and helped lead to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection to African Americans. And although they were repealed during Reconstruction, the Black Codes laid the groundwork for Jim Crow laws that would enforce racial segregation and discrimination for decades to come. Now, Jim Crow laws were state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans in the South and some border states from the late 1800s until the 1960s. They were enforced by violence and supported by the separate but equal doctrine from the 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. These laws mandated segregation in public facilities, housing, and education. They also disenfranchised black voters. Eventually, the system was dismantled by Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, but Jim Crow laws were effective in what they did. They enforced segregation by requiring separate but equal facilities for black and white people in schools, transportation, public restrooms, restaurants, and hospitals. It implemented things like poll taxes and literacy tests to prevent African Americans from voting, despite granting that right in the 15th Amendment. It also sought to reestablish the white supremacist social order, which made African Americans less than their white counterparts. Now, it is really important to remember that when I talk about black people in the context of the late 1800s, there was this idea that anyone who had one drop of black in them was considered black. So, Hispanic people, dark skinned Asian people, Italian people were often referred to as black because if you had any ethnicity at all, you weren't white, therefore you must be black. Now, when it comes to trying to figure out the types of discrimination that we wanted to combat on a government level, there are two types that we really focus on: de facto and de jure. We're focused on de jure discrimination. De jure segregation or discrimination is mandated by law or official government action. So, for example, segregated schools. Prior to the 1954 decision in Brown v. Board of Education, many states had laws requiring separate and often unequal schools for black and white students. Separate facilities where laws enforced the separation of people in public places like parks, transportation, restaurants. The Supreme Court upheld de jure segregation under the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal doctrine. This was overturned in Brown versus Board of Education, but it was the law of the land for almost 6 decades. De facto segregation, on the other hand, is separation that exists as a matter of fact rather than by legal mandate. So think about the way that people live, how people often live near people who look like them. Now, we'll talk when we talk a little bit more about housing, about how that impacts that area. But de facto segregation is affected by things like housing, socioeconomic factors, school districts, and all of those types of things are impacted. In the period following World War II, it was a transformative era for the civil rights movement, as the experience of fighting for democracy abroad sort of catalyzed the domestic struggle for equality too. Black veterans returned from a war against a racist regime to find Jim Crow laws, segregation, and racism still entrenched at home, sparking what was known as a Second Reconstruction, focused on legal challenges and grassroots activism. In 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, which mandated the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces. This led to what was known as the Double V campaign. During the war, Black Americans rallied around the idea of victory abroad over fascism and victory at home over racism. It also began to work against us on the international stage, where as the US was competing for global influence, Soviet Union was issuing propaganda highlighting American racial inequality, which pressured US leaders to make changes back at home to maintain our international credibility. We also began to see significant changes in the way that African Americans began to tackle the discrimination against them. The NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's membership surged from 50,000 to almost half a million people immediately after the war. New organizations like CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, began experimenting with nonviolent direct action, including the first Journey of Reconciliation in 1947. We also had folks like Jackie Robinson breaking color barriers in Major League Baseball, becoming a powerful signal and symbol of racial progress. So the NAACP felt like the time was finally ripe to challenge segregation. And so the NAACP utilized a deliberate, decades long legal strategy trying to dismantle segregation primarily through legal means, mostly through the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Led by visionaries like Charles Hamilton, Houston, and Thurgood Marshall, who became the first black Supreme Court justice, the organization systematically chipped away at the separate but equal doctrine established by Plessy versus Ferguson. The chipping away sort of happened in a piecemeal fashion. Rather than a direct and immediate attack on all segregation, Houston and Marshall first targeted graduate and professional schools. They argued that since states did not provide separate law or medical schools for black students, they must admit them to existing white institutions to meet the equal requirement. Several court cases highlighted this. Pearson versus Murray successfully forced the University of Maryland Law School to admit Donald Murray because no comparable black law school existed in the state. Missouri ex rel Gaines v. Canada, the Supreme Court ruled that Missouri could not send black students out of the state for law school. It had to provide a legal education within its own borders. Sweat versus Painter in 1950, the court found that a separate black law school in Texas was tangibly and intangibly inferior to the UT Law School, ordering the latter to integrate, and McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Regents in 1950 ruled that once admitted, a university could not segregate a student within the institution. For example, separate tables in the library or cafeteria. The NAACP also began to challenge Jim Crow in other areas of American life. In voting rights, Smith versus Allwright in 1944, the NAACP successfully struck down white primaries in Texas that excluded black voters. In Morgan v. Virginia in 1946, the NAACP won a ruling that barred segregated seating on interstate buses. And in Shelley versus Kramer, a 1948 case dealing with housing, the Supreme Court ruled that courts could not enforce racially restrictive real estate covenants, which banned African Americans from living in certain parts of the state. Here you can see a map that illustrates sort of the educational issue in America. Really, south of the Mason-Dixon line, we had states that required segregation, while above that line, there were states that segregation was forbidden, creating a real sort of national inequity that existed between what was happening in the North and what was happening in the South. So the landmark Supreme Court case that sort of changes everything is Brown versus Board of Education. This was a key case that ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. It unanimously overturned the separate but equal doctrine established in Plessy v. Ferguson. The court declared that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal because they generate a feeling of inferiority in black children that could not be undone. The ruling held that state-sanctioned segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court actually combined 5 cases. Brown versus Board wasn't one case, it was 5 cases in Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C., under the name of Oliver Brown, who happened to be alphabetically first. The Browns were represented by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, led by Thurgood Marshall, and this really was his stepping stone to becoming a Supreme Court justice later in his life. But Brown versus Board of Education was not met with acceptance, rather with supreme and significant resistance. Southern individuals wrote something called the Southern Manifesto. It's officially called the Declaration of Constitutional Principles, but it was a document written in 1956 by members of Congress to voice formal opposition to the ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. The manifesto condemned the Brown decision as an unwarranted exercise of power and a clear abuse of judicial power. They argued that states had a right to decide how their educational processes should go and that the federal government didn't have a right to interfere. The signatories promised that they would use all lawful means to bring about a reversal of the decision and to stop its implementation. The primary authors were Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, who would go on to oppose the Civil Rights Act of 1965, and Richard Russell Jr. from Georgia. It was signed by 101 politicians, 19 senators and 82 representatives, all who were from the 11 states of the former Confederacy. The only senators who did not sign were Lyndon Johnson from Texas. This becomes important. Al Gore Sr. from Tennessee and Estes Kefauver from Tennessee. The document was important because it provided political cover and encouragement for Southern governors and local school boards to engage in massive resistance. This led to years of legal delays, school closures, and civil unrest. The manifesto also solidified the Solid South as a bloc resistant to civil rights, a dynamic that eventually helps lead to a major shift in American political party alignment, where Democrats, particularly liberals who supported civil rights, leave the Southern Republican Party and become Democrats. Those who opposed segregations became Republicans in a solidly now conservative South. Another form of resistance was the violence that occurred by the Ku Klux Klan. In the 1960s, Klan violence reached an intensity that had not been seen in decades, as the group fought to preserve segregation through really a campaign of domestic terrorism. This era saw a shift towards paramilitary tactics, including widespread bombings, lynchings, and coordinated attacks on both African American citizens and civil rights activists. There were multiple significant acts of violence. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in 1963, which members of the United Klans of America planted dynamite at a prominent black church in Birmingham, Alabama. The blast killed 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol McNair. None were older than 14. It also injured 20 others. The event became the catalyst for the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. There were also the Mississippi burning murders, where a mob of Klansmen, including local law enforcement, abducted and murdered civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Their bodies were found 44 days later, buried in an earthen dam. The murder of Lemuel Penn in 1964. Penn was a black World War II veteran and educator. He was shot and killed by Klansmen while driving home to D.C. from a reserve training in Georgia. The assassination of Medgar Evers in 1963. The killer, Byron DeLay Beckwith, was a member of the White Citizens Council and had deep ties to Klan ideology. He assassinated the NAACP Field Secretary Evers in his own driveway in Jackson, Mississippi, in front of his family. There was violence against the Freedom Riders. Klan members, often with the complicity of local police, brutally attacked the Freedom Riders at bus stations in Anniston and Birmingham, Alabama, using pipes, chains, gloves, and bats. Clubs and bats. The Klan in the 60s utilized these methods to intimidate communities. They referred to Birmingham, Alabama as Bombingham because of the nickname for more than 50 racially motivated bombings occurring between 1947 and 1965. There were night rides where coordinated groups would drive through black neighborhoods at night, shooting into homes or burning crosses to instill fear. And law enforcement, particularly in the South, was complicit in this. Klan members were also police officers or had gentlemen's agreements with sheriffs to allow violence to go unpunished. This leads to a March on Washington by King and several of his followers. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms, which was held in August of 1963, was one of the largest and most influential political rallies for human rights in U.S. history. Attended by about 250,000 people, it became a defining moment of the civil rights movement and a catalyst for major federal legislation. The core demands were simple. The march aimed to pressure the Kennedy administration into addressing both racial and economic segregation. Key demands included a Black History Month and a passage of comprehensive legislation to end segregation in public accommodations. It also asked for federal programs to train and place unemployed workers, a national minimum wage of $2 an hour, and a ban on discrimination in hiring. It also called for the immediate desegregation of all public schools and the protection of the right to vote. The event was a rare display of unity among the leaders of civil rights organizations. You had Philip Randolph, who was basically the dean or president of the movement, who first proposed the march in 1941, almost 20 years prior. You had Bayard Rustin, who was the primary strategist and logistical genius who organized the March on Washington in less than 3 months. Martin Luther King was the head of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who delivered the final and most iconic address of the day, his I Have a Dream speech. John Lewis, who was the head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He also ended up being a congressman from Georgia. He was the youngest speaker whose originally radical speech was moderated to maintain a unified front. And finally, Roy Wilkins, James Farmer, and Whitney Young, who were co-leaders of the NAACP coalition. While all of these speakers gave impactful and important speeches, none were more important than Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It remains one of the most enduring legacies of that event. Encouraged by singer Mahalia Jackson to tell them about the dream, King departed from his prepared text to deliver a vision of racial reconciliation and justice that was broadcast to millions of people, where he called on people to no longer judge one another by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. All of this looks like it's going to lead to massive change. And then, unexpectedly, President John F. Kennedy is assassinated. He is replaced by Lyndon Johnson, a Southern senator from Texas. But Johnson commits to carrying out Kennedy's vision of civil rights equality and helps to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is largely referred to as one of the most significant legislative achievements in American history. Enacted in July of 1964, it ended the Jim Crow era by outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The act is organized into 11 sections that address different areas of public life. A couple of the most important ones. Title I dealt with voting rights and barred unequal application of voter registration requirements. Title II dealt with public accommodations and prohibited discrimination in hotels and restaurants, theaters, and other places open to the public. Title IV dealt with school desegregation and authorized the U.S. Attorney General, or the lawyer for the U.S. government, to file lawsuits to enforce school desegregation and provided federal aid to schools integrating their student bodies. Title VI was non-discrimination in federal programming, which forbade the use of federal funds for any discriminatory program or activity. And Title VII, which prohibited discrimination by employers and labor unions and created the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So this bill, as I mentioned, was initially proposed by JFK, and Lyndon Johnson picked up the pieces post his assassination. Southern senators launched a 72-day filibuster, meaning they protested the passage of this bill for almost 2.5 months. The House finally approved the Senate version in 1964, and President Johnson signed it into law. A year later, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. This landmark piece of federal legislation was designed to eliminate illegal barriers like literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation that prevented racial minorities, particularly African Americans and Hispanic folks, from voting. It fundamentally secured voting rights with key provisions enforcing the 15th Amendment and authorized federal oversight of voter registration. It banned the use of literacy tests and similar devices for voting. It also required any jurisdiction with a history of voter discrimination to obtain federal approval before changing its voting laws, trying to protect particularly minorities in the South from the South changing their voting laws to make it harder for them to vote. It also authorized the Attorney General to send federal examiners to register voters in areas with historically low turnout. It also prohibited any practice which would dilute minority voting power. This happens when they redraw districts to try to minimize the effects of Black or Hispanic voters in a particular area. There was also significant progress made in housing. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in renting, buying, financing, or advertising housing based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, and disability. It was enforced by Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Justice. Its aim was to protect against the discriminatory practices that were occurring in both private and federally assisted housing. It created protected classes, making it illegal to discriminate based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex. That was since 1974, disability since 1988, and familial status. It also prohibited the ability to refuse to rent, sell, negotiate, or to set different terms for certain individuals. It also added the Protection of the Violence Against Women Act, which provided housing protections for victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. Now, we have seen a shift in recent times. The Department of Justice continues to settle cases, including actions against zoning, sexual harassment, and discrimination in lending. But despite the fact these laws exist, there are still some significant challenges because there is discrimination that occurs based on income, sexual orientation, gender identity, and those types of things. It is important to note that we have made significant gains in civil rights over the years. We have, at least in large measure, eliminated de jure or legal segregation. We have knocked down barriers to voting and political participation for African Americans, Hispanics, Asian individuals, and poverty rates have fallen for all of those groups. We increased the number of African American, Hispanic, Asian high school graduates. We also have seen the first Black Supreme Court justice, the first Latina Supreme Court justice, the first female Supreme Court justice in the last 40 years. The Fair Housing Act has changed the way that we approach housing in America, but challenges still remain. We can see that there's still a disparity between whether or not we agree on the causes of racism in America. Black Americans are more likely to believe that racism is structural, where their white counterparts believe that it's individual. That means that minorities argue that racism is built into the system, while white people tend to believe that racism is really more about individual people who harbor negative feelings. We also can see there's still disparity in educational attainment. While almost 56% of Asian voters have earned their college degree, only about one in three white voters have, and it's about 1 in 5 Hispanic and Black voters. We also see significant disparities in wealth equality. So while the average white family of 4 is worth about $122,000 in 2024, Black and Latino families are worth less than $1,700 each. Now that has to do with the difficulty that some minorities find in being able to own houses, still facing some discriminatory lending practices, but that is an important metric for the inequality that does exist. Finally, there are still modern day challenges that we have. The issues regarding race have shifted towards challenging systemic inequalities in the criminal justice system, the weaponization of civil rights law against diversity initiatives, and the racialized impact of immigration policies. While the legal foundations were laid in the 1950s and 60s, advocates argue that a lot of our protections are being rolled back. So, in terms of criminal justice and policing, Black Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at nearly 5 times the rate of white Americans. Despite local reforms, the police killed over 1,300 people in 2025, a figure that's higher than any year in the previous decade. The use of facial recognition technology disproportionately targets minority communities, with misidentification rates for Black and Hispanic individuals reported as high as 95%, according to Amnesty International in some instances. We've also seen a movement to this sort of state and federal authorities increasingly using the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to challenge diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, arguing that they constitute reverse discrimination against white employees. There's also a significant push to end disparate impact claims. These are legal tools that allow people to challenge policies that are race neutral on the surface, but have a discriminatory effect in practice. Finally, as of early 2026, researchers have noted a shrinking Black and Hispanic middle class, and a decline in unionization gains, particularly for Black women, driven partly by federal workforce reductions. There's also significant challenges when it comes to immigration and racial profiling. Advocates have sounded alarms over heavy-handed immigration raids in major cities, which they argue disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities. By late 2025, ICE detention surged to over 3 times the 2024 totals, leading to reports of overcrowding and inadequate medical care in facilities. Federal guidance that previously limited arrests in churches and community centers has been revoked, normalizing enforcement in these what has always been sensitive areas. There have been at least 567 bills in 2024 that targeted critical race theory and Black history curriculum, leading to the omission of Black history from multiple school programs in 2026. In 2025, there were resolutions introduced in Congress to declare racism a public health crisis, citing how systemic barriers made worse the impacts of COVID-19 on households of color. So it's important to understand that we have made tremendous progress in the area of civil rights, but there are still challenges that remain. I look forward to getting to chat more about this in class. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.